Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Well, good evening and welcome to the program. I'm James Morrow, filling in for Peter Credlin this evening. Let's take a look at tonight's top stories. Here's what's coming up for you on the show. First, bad news for green activists with the COP28 conference in Dubai not even being able to give a proper virtue signal on fossil fuels after oil-rich countries like Saudi Arabia blocked the mere mention of a fossil fuel phase-out. Also, the rank hypocrisy of the UN was on full display. I know, surprise, right? Today, when it comes to the treatment of Israeli women. Would you believe it that the UN's Australian Women's Chair had the temerity to attack two coalition MPs who dared to speak out about the deafening silence over Hamas attacks on Jewish women? We'll have that coming up for you. Plus, we're going to cross live to Israel a bit later in the program to get the latest with some promising signs that the IDF is getting the upper hand over Hamas. And more worrying news as Labor pushes ahead with its contentious social media misinformation laws. New revelations today that not only will these laws curtail free speech, but the minister of the day will actually be able to call for investigations on whatever and whoever they deem to be spreading misinformation. But first, before we begin the official proceedings tonight, how about an acknowledgement of country? That's the way, obviously, progressives traditionally kick things off in Australia, right? But here's a question for you. What do progressives do when they're not in Australia? Well, have a look at this. Energy Minister Chris Bowen in Dubai on a fool's errand to convince a bunch of sheikhs to phase out fossil fuel had this to say, opening his speech to the climate summit yesterday. Chris Bowen, who, let's remember, was in a desert sheikhdom, not Alice Springs, kicked off his speech to the climate summit thusly.
Friends, I begin with an acknowledgement that at the heart of action on climate change must be profound respect for those who've cared for our respective lands for millennia, the Indigenous people across the world. I reaffirm our government's commitment to the inclusion of First Nations people in our climate change response and clean energy future, recognising that respect for Indigenous knowledge, cultures and traditional practices is critical.
Well, I guess they didn't have a referendum in Dubai, but there is so much to unpack here. Among other things, if Bowen is talking about Indigenous people across the world, well, ultimately, logically, isn't he talking about all people eventually? And really, does this give the right to, say, Anglo-Saxon Britons to weigh in on Australia's energy policy? It's all so incredibly virtuous and confusing and, dare I say, cringe. And speaking of cringe, can we also have a little word about Ed Husic and the freedom of speech? Now, as you probably know, there has been an awful lot of pro-Palestinian protest activity these days, coming mostly exclusively almost from the left, since Hamas's brutal terrorist massacres in Israel 2 months ago. One such protest involved players at the Sydney Theatre Company donning keffiyehs at an encore to show their solidarity with the Palestinian cause. Oddly, no one put on a kippah to show their sympathy with the 1,200 Israelis murdered by Hamas, but what are you going to do? The predictable debate about politics and art and free speech played out, and the fact that some people had an issue with the actor's performance and used their own free speech to say so raised the ire of Ed Husic. He's the Albanese government's industry minister, remember, and a Muslim who represents the Western Sydney seat of Greenway. And he thinks that people worrying that some of these Palestinian protests are going too far now smacks of a new McCarthyism. Yeah, that's right. Here's the minister on ABC Radio earlier today.
We had journalists, sign up to a letter that said we need to make sure that the way that we're reporting the conflict is accurate, and they've been taken off writing stories in relation to the conflict by their editorial boards. Doctors who joined in a petition that in particular focused on the humanitarian impact in Gaza. I've got reports now are being professionally investigated for their participation in that. If people express a view and have the decency to show heart in relation to what's happening in Gaza and calling out the need to recognise humanity, are then effectively professionally blacklisted, I don't think that's right.
Well, there's a few things to say about this. First of all, even though many of his claims were overcooked and hysterical, the broad thesis of Joe McCarthy was not incorrect. America and America's institutions were subject to a program of communist infiltration directed by Moscow after World War II. But secondly, that letter some activist journalists signed, well, it's straight out of the lefty playbook, calling for a false context in their reporting that ignores the repeated attacks on Israel by its Arab neighbors and throwing around words like genocide and apartheid about Israel without noting, for example, the Hamas Charter, which is an explicitly genocidal document. But let me also say this. Ed Husick and others on the left should be real careful when they talk about free speech. Look, if you're a believer in free speech, as I am, or say you are, it is incumbent on you to make sure your words have been consistent on this subject. For example, in 2019, in the wake of the Christchurch massacre, Husick wrote that, quote, words like bullets do injure, unquote. Well, okay, but then where do we draw the line? That doesn't sound very free speechy to me. Look, this is truly a tricky one for a lot of people. I get this, particularly on the left, though the right has its own blind spots too. The great danger in these debates, though, is that laws to protect people from hate speech or incitement can sometimes be used as a cudgel by one side or another to shut their opponents up. And here I'm thinking of the case of Israel Folau. Back in 2019, the deeply religious, deeply Christian Folau posted an anti-gay marriage meme on his own private Instagram page. He didn't go and wave a no gay marriage banner after a rugby match, but he was still sacked and it was very controversial. And the case became a cause célèbre for the left, which back then thought that firing someone for making a political stance their bosses or audience disagreed with was cause for firing. Ultimately, Folau settled a wrongful dismissal case with Rugby Australia, but the Wallabies have never been the same since. And many of those who are today supporting the STC actors and actresses who don keffiyehs would have been the same people who back in 2019 called for Israel Folau to be sacked. All right, let's head to Canberra now for tonight's political headlines with Sky News political reporter Trudy McIntosh.
Good evening. The Treasurer will hand down the mid-year budget update here in Parliament House tomorrow.
Well, it's a hell of a turnaround too when you compare the numbers in this document with what we confronted when we came to office.
Labor trumpeting nearly $10 billion in savings, but it's flagged over $5 billion will be spent on what the government calls unavoidable measures, including cancelling the COVID pandemic event visa and the COVID response in aged care.
It's really all about one thing, isn't it? Responsible economic management, because that's how we put downward pressure on inflation.
Jim Chalmers has already downplayed hopes that MYEFO will include any new cost of living relief. More progress in the trade ties with China. Sanctions that had been slapped on 3 of Australia's largest meat exporters have now been removed. Imports from abattoirs were suspended during the pandemic following a string of COVID outbreaks on site. Overnight, China's customs agency has announced following a review, the goods are allowed back in.
An enormous work has been done by the Trade Minister and the government in terms of putting trade back in place as we have sought to stabilise our relationship with China.
Well, we welcome the news and we want a normalised relationship, but we shouldn't sacrifice our values and our beliefs and our core equities, and that's the approach that we would support.
And Stephen Miles is set to replace Anastasia Palaszczuk as Queensland's Premier. A late-night factional deal between the left and right within Labor saw Miles emerge as leader.
The government I lead will be absolutely focused on the task of helping Queenslanders every single day in every way we possibly can.
Treasurer Cameron Dick will keep his role and become Deputy Premier.
That is the agreement that we have. We are a strong team. We've worked together for a long time.
Health Minister Shannon Fentiman's leadership tilt was short-lived, forced to bow out after conceding she didn't have the numbers. The federal opposition leader joined the political attack on the new state leader.
He will be completely and utterly owned by Mr Bullock and the union movement. And that is not what Queenslanders voted for.
Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
Now, lots to get through tonight. Joining me to find out the latest is the Australian newspaper's media writer, Sophie Ellsworth. Sophie, welcome to the program, and let's start by welcoming all the ABC Drum viewers who have just switched over to Sky News with the news that their program, their 6 p.m. panel program, The Drum, has been cancelled. Now, there will be redundancies, I understand, and it is no surprise to me why maybe the show has run out of steam. I mean, it was always a hotbed of some fairly bonkers ideas. I just want to play this little classic for you.
What about you a sourdough or a multigrain?
Is that to me?
Yeah.
Oh, mate, I'm just normal white bread.
I think the comment about bread was really, the white bread was really interesting. Who eats white bread in this country? Anglo men. I come from a working class background. We had brown bread because we were healthy.
Sophie, do they know what side their bread is buttered on? What do you make of this one?
Well, James, I will say this firstly. No one wishes people losing their jobs, so that is not a good thing. I don't wish that on anyone in the media. But moving that aside, that was one of the worst programs the ABC had on its channel. The panellists on there are discussing the Prime Minister eating white bread. I mean, get real. Some of the rubbish on there. Last night I was watching and they were talking about, are you offended or does it disturb you when people crunch when they're eating? This is the kind of insane rubbish content that they're producing on that program, and that is what taxpayers are paying for. So it's any wonder this show is axed, and perhaps it's time the ABC took a good hard look at itself, James, and realised why viewers are not watching this rubbish. This is just rubbish content that they're pushing out to viewers and no one's interested, so clearly they're not watching. So I hope this is a wake-up call to the ABC to start producing balanced programs with balanced panels and topics that are obvious interest to the population.
Well, indeed, Sophie, and I understand that Scott Morrison did have a wry sense of humour about that incident there on the drum. Just kidding. Anyway, let's move on, though, to Dubai, where there was a United Nations climate conference, COP28. Well, they dropped the phasing out of oil and gas, much to the lament of the left and the Greenies and many people in the Labour Party, including Chris Bowen, I think. And all they could come to was an actions countries could take to reduce emissions sort of verbiage. This, of course, has been slammed by all the usual folks. But, Sophie, I mean, what did Chris Bowen and his ilk think when they went to Dubai to try and save the planet from the evils, apparently, of fossil fuels?
Well, I wonder how all these politicians from around the world and executives actually got there, given they're trying to save the planet. I'm sure they all flew in on jets and planes, so all the emissions that they're putting out there. But that aside, James, I think actually in all seriousness, this is probably a win for the population who are very concerned about their cost of living, their power bills going up, and what it means with this transition to clean energy and the cost that the transition will bear on households. So while this obviously irritates a lot of the left side of politics, I think general population struggling with cost of living will be breathing a sigh of relief that they will not completely phase out fossil fuels.
Yeah, no, I think you make a really good point there, Sophie, that the end result here actually winds up being a good one for us, even if it's not necessarily for the activists, and I think that's probably correct. But let's move to closer to home now. There's more evidence that Labor is not across its brief when it comes to protecting Australia from would-be terrorists. It's been revealed that a last-minute bid to impose strict rules on a released terrorist who wanted to attack AFP headquarters nearly failed because Here's that name again, Attorney General Mark Dreyfus's people did not have a case ready until 3 days before the Islamic extremist was set to go free. Sophie, it's not just Anthony Albanese here who is not across the brief and is not getting things ready and is not in charge of what needs to be done before things happen, is it here? It seems like we've got a real problem in the Attorney General's portfolio.
Well, there certainly is a problem here, James, and the Australian's Liam Mendes exposed this today in his scoop with photos and reporting on the front page of the Australian, just showing what a farce this is. This is a real concern for Australians, and it seems that Mr Dreyfus, while he got a bit hot under the collar last week and quite angry at a press conference, perhaps needs to really rethink his strategy here, because at the moment, the federal government look like they don't know what is going on. And this is another example of this. There's days and days of examples of this. And no wonder the public is concerned about who is out there, who is being released. And I'm sure there'll be more of these stories, unfortunately, to come on this, James. So a real concern for the Australian public, but perhaps another wake-up call for the federal government, including the Attorney-General, Mr Dreyfus.
Absolutely right, Sophie. Let's go to Queensland now. Stephen Miles is going to be the next Queensland Premier with a state election now only 10 months away. Polls show Labor is going to be booted at this stage. What's your reaction to Stephen Miles as Premier there? And do you think there's a chance at all that Labor hangs on at that next election?
Well, James, never say never. Look, if I was to put a bet on it, I'd probably be going the fact that I think the Liberals up there the LNP up there will actually be successful, not the Labor Party. It's a third-term government. People get sick of governments typically after 3 terms, but he has an almighty task on his hands. It's whether Queenslanders, James, think that he's different to Anastasia Palaszczuk, because they were obviously very tight, and people see him. When they see him, they think of her because, they're so prominent. Those two politicians are so prominent. So whether this is enough of a reset and a refresh for Queenslanders, I'm not sure it will be, James, but we'll wait and see.
We will have to do that, Sophie. We'll wait and see. Sophie Ellsworth from The Australian, thank you so much for your time. Now, as I've been saying for weeks, many of the world's human rights and women's rights organizations have proven themselves to be a complete hypocritical joke, given their deafening silence over the rape and sexual assaults and torture of Israeli women by Hamas terrorists on the 7th of October. And more evidence continues to pile up. This week, it was revealed that 2 senior Liberal MPs, though, were confronted by the chair of the UN Women Australia organization over their criticism of the UN body for its almost 2-month silence about Hamas's crimes. Joining me now to get the details is Liberal Senator for Tasmania, Claire Chandler. Senator, thank you so much, and you have been such a strong advocate on these issues. Take us through the details here and explain just what happened.
Thanks very much for having me on the show, James. Look, what happened here was that UN Women Australia, a group that should be advocating for the rights of women everywhere, took 7 weeks before they begrudgingly condemned Hamas for the murder and rape and sexual assault of Israeli women on the 7th of October and since then. And I think quite rightly, a couple of my Liberal colleagues, Sarah Henderson and Georgie Crozier from Victoria, both called out that abhorrent behaviour on behalf of the UN Women Australia organisation, their complete failure to condemn Hamas, and from the sounds of it have since found themselves at the end of criticism from the chair of UN Women Australia for calling out UN Women's very own bad behaviour. So I think this is a bit of a sad reflection on this organisation that already wasn't doing anywhere near enough to defend women's rights, but to then come out and criticise people for rightly pointing that out, I think is pretty disgraceful.
Well, indeed, so much of the UN organization and all of these outfits that we associate with, their claims to be pro-feminist, pro-women, it's not just this one outfit. It's been organizations like this around the world, hasn't it?
Well, that's right, James. And look, I don't want to make any reflections on the worldwide feminist movement, because I know there are many women who call themselves feminists who have spoken out against what is happening to Israeli women, and I congratulate them for that. But what I think this demonstrates with UN Women in particular is this broader issue that we are seeing now of how institutionalised anti-Semitism has become. You only have to look at some of the evidence that's been provided in US Congress over the last week of heads of universities unable to condemn clearly anti-Semitic behaviour on their campuses to know that this is a very, very broad and very deep problem. And what we're seeing from UN Women is just the latest example of that.
And I mean, Senator, you bring up what happened at Harvard and these other universities in the United States. We've seen a little bit of that here. How much of this, then, it really ties up into the bigger issue that identity politics around both gender, and we've seen that from issues around the trans issue here, but then also, race and identity, they all wind up coming back and mixing in these very sorts of unfortunate ways, don't they?
They absolutely do. I mean, UN Women is one of these organisations that not only can't define what a woman is, but shows absolutely no inclination to actually defend women's sex-based rights. And I've been hearing complaints about this particular organisation in that regard for many, many years now. And unfortunately, it's just not surprising to me that they've failed at this hurdle in terms of condemning Hamas as well.
Tasmanian Senator Claire Chandler, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time in bringing this story to us. Now, coming up, we're going to get the details on newly released documents that clearly show Labor wants the power to direct bureaucrats to investigate Australians, maybe you, for peddling so-called misinformation if they don't like what you're saying on the socials. Plus, we're going to get the latest on fresh evidence that the Dan Andrews government didn't use empirical evidence, and used science to drive its lockdown and vaccine mandate policies. Not going to want to miss that. Now, I want to go to Victoria, where it has been... Welcome back to the program. James Morrow here, sitting in for Peter Credlin. Now, if we have learned one thing from the past 5 or so years, it is that governments always tell the truth and never, ever try to manipulate information to advance their own agendas, right? I mean, anybody who thinks differently is probably guilty of spreading harmful propaganda and, dare I say it, misinformation through words that could be considered hurtful or even dangerous. Well, this is why the Albanese government is pushing for its new misinformation laws to be passed in the next sitting of Parliament next year. The legislation, though, I gotta say, is really chilling, and this makes it worse. A letter has been unearthed by a Freedom of Information request that found Communications Minister Michelle Rowland demand that the PM grant her the power to direct the powerful Australian Communications and Media Authority to be able to, quote-unquote, commence investigations into Australians who supposedly spread misinformation. Shocking stuff. And joining me now to get to the bottom of it is Shadow Communications Minister David Coleman. David, thanks so much for joining me this evening. Tell me about these documents. It sounds to me like the Minister of the Day, whoever that is, could sick a massive communications bureaucracy on their political opponents based on a charge of misinformation.
That's right, James, they could. This is the horror scenario laid out very clearly in the letter to the Prime Minister. So what it says is the Minister will be able to direct ACMA to conduct investigations into misinformation. The Minister can specify the terms of reference, the time frame, and it says any other particulars about that investigation. So imagine the scenario where the Minister, in this case Michelle Rowland, doesn't like something that's been said online, says, well, look, that seems like misinformation to me. We need to investigate that digital platform that has published that so-called misinformation, and then forces the bureaucrats to conduct that investigation on the terms she specifies. Now, that is the exact thing that people worry about when they think about these misinformation laws. And what this letter says is that's what's going to happen if these laws come into being.
Well, and when you put that in the context of two things that are in the draft legislation, one, that the government itself can never be guilty of misinformation. And of course, anybody who lived through the last several years knows that the government never, ever spreads misinformation. But also that the ACMA can determine the when, the where that somebody has to report, and they can be fined for every single day they don't report. Isn't that right?
It's exactly right. So the scenario would be the minister says, ACMA, you need to investigate this, and relevant to that investigation are the following issues, which presumably would involve the following posts and the following people. ACMA can then direct that person to show up as part of the investigation. If the person does not attend at a time specified by ACMA, they can be fined $9,000 per day. It's in the legislation. It's in black and white, and it's an extraordinary that in one of the world's very greatest democracies, Australia, that its government would put forward a bill like this.
And David, tell me, it all seems very loose, this idea of what misinformation is. I mean, first of all, it seems like you're almost criminalizing being wrong, which can happen in a democracy where you have free speech and ideas get tested back and forth. But really, isn't misinformation now whatever the government of the day, be they the coalition, be they Labor, be they whomever, just decides they don't like?
Yeah, well, all the legislation says, James, is that it's an unintentionally misleading statement. Now, think about that. Every day, Australians would make thousands of statements which are unintentionally misleading. And secondly, that it causes so-called serious harm. But serious harm is so broadly defined as to include things like harm to the environment or harm to the economy or a section of the economy. So you're right. I mean, it's effectively whatever the government of the day says it is. And we now know that it's not just the bureaucrats, it's the minister, the elected politician who can dictate the terms of those investigations. It's very troubling. And a really important point here, James. Now, we found out about this through a Freedom of Information application. The government released more than 30 pages of documents describing the misinformation bill when it came out. And this issue, the minister's power to direct investigations, is mentioned nowhere at all. So not only do we have the power that we've unearthed, but we also have the government failing to mention it for the past 6 months.
Yeah, and, you know, I think we could put some numbers around this, too, the real sort of threat here, because when The Voice was being debated, we heard the term misinformation thrown around an awful lot. I was accused of it for saying that the Uluru statement was 26 pages, and hey, presto, it turned out to be 26 pages. But we had a recent IPA report that found that the fact-checkers published 187 fact-checking articles related to The Voice, and of those assessments, 91% of them, or 170 of them, targeted the no case. So doesn't this just show how when the government, even without this sort of misinformation law, is pushing something from the left, there's a whole group of people out there who come falling behind it to try and shut down anything that's contradicting their narrative?
Yes, I think that's exactly right, James. And the Voice is a good example to raise, because if the Voice debate had occurred after these laws come in, we now know that the minister can direct an investigation at any time into misinformation issues. So would those laws have been used against people arguing the no case in the Voice campaign? Absolutely they would have. Absolutely they would have. And so that's very chilling when you think about future political debates in Australia and granting these extraordinary powers to the minister.
And David, just before I let you go, this bill, when it went up for an exposure draft period in consultation on the Communications Department website, it received thousands and thousands of submissions, including from human rights groups and other bodies, legal outfits, saying, we're pretty uncomfortable with this. Do you think that the government is going to resile from this at all, or are they going to push it through in its current form next year?
Well, the minister had to get rid of her time frame of getting the legislation through this year. because of the backlash and because of how appalling it is. The government is still saying they're going to press on. And if they press on with a bill that gives the minister the power to order misinformation investigations into basically anything they want, a bill that exempts the government but not critics of the government, a bill that exempts comedians and academics but not everyday Australians, well, they're going to have a massive fight on their hands, James, because this is absolutely wrong for this country, this bill. It should never have been put forward, and we will fight it every step of the way.
David Coleman, Shadow Communications Minister, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thanks, James.
Now let's go to Victoria, where it's been revealed that a senior Andrews government bureaucrat described Victorians who were opposed to COVID-19 lockdowns as believing, quote, tyrannical government is the enemy and embracing fantastical conspiracy theories, and said they chose individual rights ahead of collective rights. Sorry, I thought this was a democracy. Joining me to get across the details of this outrage is Libertarian member of the Victorian Legislative Council, David Limbrick. David, welcome to the program. Take us through the details of what has been revealed here.
Well, the government was definitely listening to doctors, but in this case, they're listening to spin doctors. What we saw throughout the pandemic was a bunch of authoritarian health bureaucrats who gave the government these directions based on a single metric, which was to stop the number of transmissions. Of course, they would do everything within their power to go ahead with that. Now, what we were wondering all along is how was the government measuring the proportionality? You know, did they have some sort of principles framework where they care about individual rights, where they, don't want to act like a tyrannical government? But now we find out that actually the limiting factor was a bunch of focus groups that effectively informed the government on how much they could get away with. And that seems to have been the limiting factor. And this is really scary because one of the things that also came up was that they categorised people into these 5 categories. And you had category 1 and 2, which were like basically compliant people who will do what the government tells them. Category 3, which was sort of, they were people that were on the fence and the government felt like they could influence them. It seems like most of the government messaging was directed towards them. And government 4 and 5, well, I suppose I'm in that category, who was standing up against what we see as tyrannical government. And the government just wrote these people off effectively. They didn't believe that they could convince them of anything, and they effectively threw them under the bus.
David, I think you're probably a 6 in my book, but you'd be congratulated for that. If I'm reading all of this right, then it sounds like what they tried to do here is basically scare the people as much as they could into giving up as many of their rights, divided the population into believers and non-believers, and then when it came time to start to unwind the restrictions, then did they use these focus groups again to decide, when people were comfortable with not being scared anymore?
Yeah, it seems like they used the focus groups on the way out as well, like quite late in the pandemic, to try and figure out, which sort of freedoms would people be happiest to get back. Are they able to go to the park and maybe watch a sunset again, or go and have dinner with their friends? The crazy thing here, and this is the scary thing and why it's relevant to get to the bottom of this, is what I fear is that government has learned what they can get away with and how to get away with stuff and how to get away with trampling individual rights. And they'll do it again. Like, they'll do it for people who, are they already categorising us for other things? Our belief in global boiling and these other things, like, we don't know. And, is this standard operating procedure for the government now? It's hard to know.
Well, and does it just very quickly make you worried when you hear people talk about, anything from a digital ID to, a future pandemic, that all of this is now set up a playbook for bureaucrats to make an emergency worse than it might be in order to then start to acquire more power again?
All they have to do is say, we're doing this to save lives, and it looks like they can get the category 1s and 2s across the line. It's a very scary scenario. Of course, I think that the solution is we need to start looking at the grand project of winding back the power of the state. The scale and power of the state is too large. We need to start winding it back and start talking about reducing the size of government.
Well, here, David Limbrick, thank you so much for your time this evening. Now, don't go anywhere, because coming up, we're going to get the latest from Gaza, where the Israeli Defense Force is on the verge of destroying, some say, Hamas once and for all. Plus, we're going to bring in our panel to talk about Chris Bowen's decision to give that crazy welcome to country at a COP climate conference in Dubai. You couldn't make it up if you tried. Welcome back to the program. James Morrow here, filling in for Peter Credlin. Now to the war in Gaza, where Israeli forces claim Hamas strongholds in the north of the Gaza Strip are on the brink of collapse. Israel Defense Minister Yoav Gallant told reporters hundreds of Hamas operatives have surrendered in recent days, many claiming to be without food or weapons. Meanwhile, Hamas has warned it will not release any more hostages until its prisoner release demands are met. For more on all this, I'm joined by former Israeli ambassador to Australia, Mark Sofer. Mark Sofer, thank you for coming to us live from Tel Aviv here tonight. Mark, just got to ask you, first of all, how are you going in Tel Aviv, and what's the mood in Israel right now?
Well, the mood is really as it was, still reeling from in a state of shock, horror and revulsion of the tragedy that was inflicted upon us on the 7th of October on the one hand, and yet resilience and resolve and determination that not only will this never happen again, but that the Hamas will be decimated to such an extent that it will not rule in Gaza anymore on the one hand, but also will not have any military capability of launching any type of attack on Israel in the future as well. So it's two sides really of an issue, but still the sorrow, the anger, the hurt, the tragedy, the catastrophe that was inflicted upon us is very, very, very far from being forgotten at all.
Sure, of course, and we all understand that. But the IDF now says that it's on the verge of dismantling Hamas battalions in at least the north. What does this mean now strategically? And are we getting to a point now where we could see Hamas finally, I don't know, would they be crushed? Would they surrender? What would that look like? What would that end game start to look like?
Well, the decimation of Hamas in the north of Gaza is one thing, and it's about to be completely achieved. The problem still exists of Hamas in the south, of course, and there we are daily encountering battalions of Hamas terrorists, but all of them actually underground. You know, it's been discovered in the last weeks that there is a greater tunnel operation underground than there is, in fact, on the London Underground. Over 500 kilometres of tunnels. They've built a city, a state under Gaza. So we find ourselves really in a very, very difficult situation of uprooting and bringing them out of their tunnel systems. Of course, it costs hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to build such a tunnel system inside of a built-up area, money which could and, of course, should have been used for welfare, for schooling, for education, for healthcare, and you name it. But no, the Hamas took the money and used it basically to build up a military infrastructure underground.
Yeah, well, it's shocking that, but when now, if you've got all of these people living underground now, once you've got control over the ground level, the surface level, though, will the IDF be able to essentially starve them out? They won't have any water, they won't have any food. They're going to have to start to come out eventually, won't they?
Well, one of the problems that we faced, which is uppermost in our mind, is the issue of the hostages. There's still over 130, maybe 137 hostages still in captivity, probably being held underground as well. So these are issues that we have to deal with one at the same time. It's not only a question of starving them out. They may probably have stockpiled food there for goodness knows how long. They've certainly stolen it from the aid trucks that have come in. So yes, we will have to deal with the underground tunnels. We have been dealing with them. Over 700 of them have already been destroyed in the north and in parts of the south, but now we have to deal with the rest, and there's still some time unfortunately, for this war to go on. I wish it would end tomorrow, and it could end tomorrow, were the Hamas to surrender immediately and give up the hostages, but they don't seem to be doing that, and so we will continue until we've decimated them completely.
I mean, as a matter of diplomacy, do you find it just bizarre that so many people in the West, call on Israel to participate in a ceasefire, but Hamas could have a ceasefire in the next hour if they just simply declared all of their hostages would be released and they were going to stop, right?
Well, it's more than bizarre, but it fits in very well with the narrative of what we saw even before Israel had reacted to the horror and the tragedy and the despicable savagery of Hamas on the 7th of October, when even on that same evening, including in Australia, I must say, sadly, people were out in the streets screaming, burn the Jews, destroy Israel, etc. This is part of a narrative which exists among extremists, something we've had to deal with all our existence since 48, and in fact earlier. And so we're pretty much used to it. But the fact of the matter is, this is a just war. This is a war to ensure that such a tragedy and such a horror never is inflicted upon us again. And we will continue.
And is there a problem, though, then, we see these boycotts and other social media campaigns against businesses that are linked to Israel or even just have Jewish owners, which, of course, has horrible echoes of 1930s Germany. But within the era of social media, do those messages then come back and wind up tipping the conflict in one way or the other, or give some sort of false support to Hamas, thanks to, I guess there's no other word for it, but useful idiots in the West who decide that they want to support these guys?
Well, I think, James, calling them useful idiots is a nice way of calling them. People who boycott Jews, as you said earlier, is analogous to the worst times of history in the last century, on the one hand. But on the other hand, it's anti-Semitism in its purest form. It also bolsters, and this is very important indeed, the truism that we've always known, the fact that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are two sides of the same coin. In other words, you attack Jews when you hate Israel. Which clearly is one and the same thing in their minds and in the minds of any anti-Zionist. So, yes, this is pure and simple anti-Semitism on the one hand. On the other, no, it doesn't affect our economy in any way whatsoever, but it does affect, and it may affect those of the Jewish community, not only in Australia, but throughout the world. But again, the community is united. The Jewish community throughout the international arena is united with Israel on this, except for a few exceptions on the extremes. And yet, incidentally, so is Israel. And this is a very rare cause, because in Israel we are very much divided. We are very much split on a number of issues, as you know. But on this particular issue, we are completely and utterly unified and united.
Mark Sofer, thank you so much for joining me tonight on Credlin. Now, coming up, pressure is on the leaders of several Ivy League colleges to resign after they refuse to say that calls for genocide is against university hate speech policy. Imagine that. Welcome back to the program. James Morrow here, filling in for Peter Credlin. And I want to go back to an issue that we talked about at the very start of the show. Today, Science and Industry Minister Ed Husic doubled down on his stance that workers, including journalists, doctors, actors, should be able to sympathize with Palestine without fear or favor of professional retribution. But that's not all. Speaking on ABC Radio, the Labour MP also said that people who are showing concern for the Palestinians faced, quote unquote, our generation of McCarthyism. Have a quick listen to this.
People should be able to express their concern and stand with humanity and say that they have, that they are very concerned about what they're seeing in Gaza, and they shouldn't have to face professional retribution as a response.
To discuss all this, I'm joined by former Labour MP Michael Danby and Sky News host James McPherson. James, I want to get your take on this, first of all. I mean, free speech is something that we hear bandied around an awful lot, but McCarthyism, that seems like a pretty nutty thing to say.
Yeah, I mean, we've got people yelling gas the Jews. We've got mobs throwing rocks at synagogues in Caulfield and storming hotels because Jews are staying in the Melbourne CBD. But the real problem, James, is actors not being able to use their platform to spew hatred against the Jews. It's an absurd proposition. But good on Ed Husic, a member of the left, for suddenly discovering free speech. I wonder if he'll defend the rights of, say, doctors to speak against gender fluidity without being reported to HR. I wonder if he'll go that far, or are there only certain forms of free speech that he defends?
James, let's not get so extreme there. I mean, we know there are limits to these sorts of things, and saying that a man can't get pregnant, that is
that's
absolutely
a step too
beyond
far.
The pale. Michael Danby, I want to bring you in here on the on the chat here. Ed Husic specifically talked about journalists, and he said that journalists who signed a petition about war coverage, siding with the Palestinians, were then pulled off coverage over fears that they would be biased. But I've read the letter, and the letter is really just a piece of activist propaganda. It talks about apartheid and genocide, and it doesn't talk anything about any of the context of Jewish history, modern or ancient, in Israel.
And it doesn't talk about the civilizational challenge of the Hamas mass rapes. How dare these left-wing journalists and Ed Husic back them when they say nothing about this. Just like the UN Security Council couldn't mention the Hamas attacks when they call for the ceasefire. This whole event in the Middle East is showing in the Western world the degree of hypocrisy that some people have. James outlined it perfectly, Husic's double standards. He's a disappointment as a minister. He should have not stopped Australian satellite programs that Greg Sheridan has pointed out are so important for our military defence. But, you know, the bloke who was taken out of the ABC and sent to Turkey was exposed by Sophie Ellsworth as claiming that the rapes and the baby killings didn't happen. So, you know, he deserved his fate for being unprofessional and making a judgment about things he couldn't have known. And how crazy is it for Ed Husic sitting in Canberra to defend that?
Indeed. And I want to continue this discussion here with another element to this, and this is what's happening over at Harvard and many universities in the United States, where in the woke American education system, we saw last week the presidents of 3 elite Ivy universities grilled over growing anti-Semitism at their schools. Now, the responses went viral, and the president of one of the schools, University of Pennsylvania, was forced to resign. James McPherson, there's also been calls for the other 2 to resign. I have it on very good authority that Claudine Gay, who was the Harvard president, who said that these things needed to be put in context when deciding whether a call for genocide was hate speech, she's going to survive. Michael mentioned a very important word before, civilization. What is happening to our civilization when one of the most important sort of things, this top leading university, can't even manage moral clarity on an issue like this?
Well, the anti-Semitism that we saw from those university presidents, and it was shocking, but it's merely a manifestation of a deeper problem within our tertiary institutions, and that is for a long time they've not become places of inquiry, but places of indoctrination. Gender theory, critical race theory, demonisation of Western culture, and so it's going to take a lot more than a few resignations to change what is a deep-seated culture within our universities. It's going to take a full uprooting of diversity, inclusion, equity, that whole woke indoctrination of young people who will be our future leaders. And we're at a pivotal moment here where we've got a chance to do something about it. It's been exposed and it needs to be dealt with more than just a couple of resignations at the top.
And Michael, we've really seen this sort of thing playing out too in some universities, not as bad in the United States, but we've certainly seen incidences on campus and even in high schools and primary schools. What is the solution to uprooting this sort of woke DEI mind virus that allows anti-Semitism and all sorts of other bizarre thoughts into the classrooms and generating these ideas into future generations?
Curiously, I think that what happens in the United States will make people here react in a different way. So if Harvard gets rid of their president and replaces her with their old former director, Larry Summers, and he runs a broom through the whole institution, as James and you have described the reasons for. It's not just this anti-Semitism issue. You've got to get rid of all of these DEI woke crazies if you're going to clean up the institution. But it's worse, James. I congratulate you on your fantastic program on America. Saturday Night Live ran a program in favour of the Harvard professor and was mocking the Republican Stefanik. I mean, it's seeped into television and into the wider culture. If it can be defeated in America, hopefully it can be brought to heel here.
Very well said, Michael. And James, just very quick reaction. The Australia Day celebration has been brought back at the London High Commission. Your reaction, why did it happen in the first place?
Because they got caught, James. That's why it happened, because there was such an uproar. They thought we'd better backtrack. We're in enough trouble as it is with the polls without upsetting more people. They got caught.
Well, I think you're absolutely right there. And this is a sign of what we're going to have to deal with as Australia Day comes closer and closer in the next few weeks. That's all the time we've got here tonight. I'm James Morrow here for Peter Credlin. I'll be here tomorrow night, but in the meantime, stay tuned because coming up now, Steve Price filling in for Andrew Bolt. Have a great night.